Thank you very much. Thanks so much for being here. I'm going to crack on because I know people are giving up their lunch breaks. Just to quickly say, though, that our work has also been brilliantly supported by animal bone experts at Durham University, environmental specialists at the University of Reading. We've also benefited from the ground-penetrating radar skills that the Ludwig Boltzmann Institute's Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes project offers, and least but not least, Amesbury Town Council, who, as you'll hear, really saved the project early on. So good for them to get a plug. Now, in a lot of ways, Donald Rumsfeld gets Stonehenge best, actually, although he wasn't talking about Stonehenge, with the idea that there are known knowns, unknown unknowns, and then also some known unknowns. And in terms of the type of Bronze Age and the early and also the Neolithic in the area, I think there are increasingly more and more known knowns because of brilliant work done by other teams. But the area of Stonehenge that's really still quite, at least in terms of public consciousness, a type of missing link is its backstory. So what I'm going to be doing, I'll be talking about Blick Mead, but I'm also going to be showing how Blick Mead had an effect on the pre-Stonehenge ritual landscape, which might have actually influenced the establishment of that landscape. So in effect, I will be pushing things from, hopefully, from unknown unknowns into at least some known unknowns. All right, so here's the area where of topic of interest. Whoops. I think I've just turned it right off, actually. There we are. That's good. Blick Mead, hidden by this hill down by Vespasian's camp. I'll be briefly touching on West Amesbury Henge. You may know it as Bluestones, the Coneybury Ridge, King Barrow Ridge, Stonehenge itself, of course, and the Cursus, and Durrington Walls and Woodhenge. There's quite a lot to squeeze in about 50 minutes. Here's Blick Mead. Absolutely wonderful site, and please do have a look at that carbon date range listed there. I'm going to be going through our new radiocarbon dates, which have just come out since the early summer. Francis Pryor has been good enough to say now in publication, longest proven occupation of a British Mesolithic site. But in fact, a number of specialists are considering that this may be the longest range of Mesolithic use of one particular place in Europe. It really is an extraordinary close to 4,000 years use of this one particular spot. And you'll see, of course, how close it is to the A303. And one of the aspects to touch on today is the threat of the tunnel and what it might be doing to some of the environmental record we have at the site. Just to put the site into perspective, only 10 years ago, Professor Tim Darvell was saying this about the later Mesolithic. Little can be said about either the technological or cultural relationships of the 7th to 5th millennium BC material around Stonehenge, as there is simply not enough of it to judge. And to be precise about that, only 30 or so work flints from the Mesolithic period had been found up until 2006. And the Mesolithic period is the longest period actually in British history, roughly speaking, running from about 8,500 BC to around 4,500 BC or so was thought. Huge missing link here. Very old because just as Stonehenge itself, and people in the audience may be aware of this, the earliest monuments actually in the whole of Western Europe dating to the Mesolithic, and we'll be looking at them a little later on. This is the view of Stonehenge, maybe the type of view that Valerie was talking about experiencing, from King Barrow Ridge. It's a type of interesting vista. Around this spot actually is where the greatest concentration of the Mesolithic work flint was found previous to our site. And I think it's interesting, and it maybe gives you a clue as to why Stonehenge is situated where it is, and it gives you a sense of how people may have used it from a hunter-gatherer cultural point of view. So, people might well be asking in the audience how on earth it can be that this Mesolithic site with this huge date range. I should say there are 18 radiocarbon dates. They're really neatly sequenced, but particularly prolific in the 5th millennium BC, which is of interest in itself. How it could be that this site was totally missed, bearing in mind all the expertise that this area has been subject to, all the archaeological expertise for at least 100 years. This 1773 map gives you a couple of insights. First of all, most archaeologists assume that Vespasian's camp, and the red X marks the spot for Blick Mead, by the way, that Vespasian's camp had been massively landscaped as part of an 18th century landscape garden programme, and that because of that, all of its archaeology was denuded. And the area around the X, where the site is, that was written off as an 18th century water feature. So going into this type of area of research, I had to contend with that. However, if you look closely at this map, there's also a clue, or at least a quite a substantial clue really, that this idea of this widespread landscaping is slightly a myth. Because if you look at where the X is, you'll see that in fact that area is just outside of the landscaping. And this is work I did when I was a student. So I've really been working on this for absolutely ages. I went through all the estate records, the Queensbury estate records and the Antrobus estate records, and was pretty much sure that that side of you might see that there's an 18th century pathway going out into the park. That side of the pathway, not touched. So potentially, this was a very interesting thought. This is Blick Mead as it is now in 2005. I think sort of interesting. Can you see that natural landform sweeping up towards the sea of Countess Farm, and also the field boundary going through the N of Countess Farm? You can see in this picture that actually this is the field boundary here. So, and we discovered early on, in fact, that it was an ancient lynchet. But we had loads of problems, ladies and gentlemen, right from the get-go with the site. One of them is that the Antrobus family are very understandably wary of archaeologists because they didn't want what is in fact their garden trashed by us. And the Antrobus family have a long history of being very careful and choosy about the sorts of people that they allow on their land. For example, Charles Darwin was slung off Stonehenge because they owned Stonehenge, when he was very keen to do some experiments with worm movements at Stonehenge. So the Antrobus family guard their place very much. We also had a problem that no archaeological team had actually dug in a spring before, or any type of water feature. We also had the problem that we had real difficulties in getting grants. Partly because of the two things I've mentioned earlier. So all told, there are real problems stacked up for us. And unlike other teams in the locality, we managed on £2,000 a year from 2005 to 2010, which is, people will know in the room, is absolute peanuts when it comes to archaeology. We were only able to afford a long weekend dig in that time, one long weekend dig per year. Now, those difficulties, that's it. If those difficulties weren't awesome enough, we also had the situation that there had been illegal dumping when the A303 was widened in the late 1960s onto the site. So you'll see from the slate here, this is our whole piece of work in 2008. We're trying to find the side of the spring. Got excited when we hit chalk, thinking that we might have found something pristine, but right underneath it, going back to oil, some soil again. So clearly this had been dumped. And in fact, just underneath that ranging pole, we found a crisp packet, which was absolutely just devastating. Trying to follow the line of stratigraphy and trying to keep the team up, because you could imagine people's expressions, ladies and gentlemen, right at the end when we found the crisp packet. I did send it off to Walkers, and it's of a type of crisp packet that dates to the late 1960s. So that type of was quite neat. It type of summed up that this dumping had been made then. But loads of problems, loads of problems. Nonetheless, when we were able to afford a water pump, it was in fact donated to us by Kinetic, the biggest employer in Amesbury, and we were able to go below 50 centimetres, we started to find Mesolithic tools. And in fact, just this number here is over a third of the total Mesolithic flint tools and work flints ever found in a 2-kilometre radius around Stonehenge. So these were big, big discoveries. But they are really dwarfed by the scale of the discoveries that we've made since. And since 2013, when the University of Buckingham embraced the project, things have just dramatically type of increased with the funding. And one of the things that have increased is the number of the tools that we found and work flint. So we're now on about 35,000. So this is in a place which had been, is a type of period in Stonehenge's history, which had been really written off as a type of, at best, enigmatic, and the slightest footprints. And then all of a sudden, we're finding all this material in a very small area. We still have only dug about 36 metres square, which is, often just a season's worth for most archaeological teams. Alongside the bone, alongside the work flint is the discovery of this animal bone, which is incredibly important. Just to have very well-preserved animal bone from the Mesolithic is really rare. Obviously it has immediate radiocarbon dates potential, but the other thing is it helps us get some sense of the environment, subsistence patterns, generally how people were living, and gives you some sense also of the function of the sites. In terms of the radiocarbon date range, most of it has come from animals. And you'll see these are the dates up to 2015. I will go through the new ones a little later on. But a lovely suite of dates, really good sequence, really nothing like it found in Britain, certainly, and nothing like it found in Europe. You'll see that the top two radiocarbon dates, the earliest ones, have a direct match with the earliest monuments at Stonehenge. These are these posts made out of pine. And then we run all the way nicely through down to 4336 to 4246, the only date at this point that had come from charcoal, all the way through to the doorstep of the Neolithic. So this is a really big new thing in terms of understanding Stonehenge. So not only have we picked up traces of the Mesolithic, but we're seeing that this implies really that the landscape is well known and utilised for a long time before Stonehenge and the other monuments go up. So the big question is there a relationship, is there some sort of association and connection between the Mesolithic backstory and what happened in the early Neolithic? Here are these first monuments really incongruously displayed by English Heritage at the time. Of course, the car park has since been ripped up, but they're underneath these three white circles, which I'm sure a lot of tourists might have just thought were very type of eccentric, small British roundabouts. Very, very type of inadequate display board on the other side of the fences there. But you'll see that they are an enormously early date. We're talking, just to sort of sum this up, we're talking at the early end of this, at a time when Britain is still joined to the continent, all the way through to the type of original Brexit, when we separated from it, and then beyond. So there are all of those type of environmental consequences. Why are people coming here, and they carry on coming here, for such a long period of time, especially when they're having to deal with all these differences in climates? Mike Parker Pearson has sort of put these posts into context. He says that they date to the earliest stages of Blick Mead, likely that we found the people who were responsible for putting them up. And he makes the point at the beginning there, 50 years of large-scale excavations, nothing like it found in Western Europe. So these are a big deal. Suddenly we're able to give them a type of context. Big question early on for us was, we're finding all of these thousands of tools and work flints. Were there any signs that this is a community that's just basically local, Was it a mixture of locals and other people coming in? And wonderful discovery made by the site custodian, Mike Clark, 4 years ago. He spotted what is in fact Britain's only slate tool made of slate. The exciting thing about it is, obviously slate is exotic to Stonehenge, and we've subjected it to an X-ray fluorescence machine, and that indicates, I mean, these things are quite broad brush, but broadly speaking, it indicates that this may have come from Wales or perhaps the Welsh borders. It's not being knocked around at the bottom of a glacier. If you look, the edges are quite sharp. But the great thing is, if you look closely at the next slide, it looks as though, I think this is rather wonderful, it looks as though it's been fashioned in the style of a Horsham point, which, as the name suggests, it's a sort of Sussex wheeled type of mid-Neolithic arrow point. Now, if you just look closer, you can see there is that raised shoulder. And bear in mind, of course, that slate can't be napped. It can only be type of conchoidally fractured. So people have made efforts to type of mirror what's going on in the Horsham point there, even to the point that the characteristic notch that's on the Horsham point is repeated at the base of the slate. So I actually think that this is really quite a major discovery for British history, for all of us, because we have this, probably the earliest example of different groups meeting up and communicating ideas about technology and probably other cultural ideas at this point. It's like perhaps a East meets West moment. I think it's rather moving, really. Not just the slate either. We found this wonderful, I actually excavated this myself, Sandstone Tall, again, unique find in Britain. We think it's definitely been worked, and we think it's probably being used to sort of iron out animal skin, but it would have to be very big animal skin. Provenanced, again, very broadly speaking, but possibly to the West Midlands. So again, have this, these indicators that people are coming in a long way to the site, and type of interestingly prefiguring what happened later on, the type of movement that we know about coming into Stonehenge in the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age, so people coming in from elsewhere to gather. One of the reasons why they're gathering, almost certainly, is because of the large amount of aurochs that we have discovered were in the locality. That's an Oryx vertebrae, second one down from the neck. Imagine how big that is if you look at the 20 peak for scale. Huge wild boar there as well. But rather than, I was really pleased by this burnt toad's leg. It wasn't a frog's leg. Rather than people just thinking that people are just in for very big scale feasts and perhaps moving on somewhere else afterwards, the fact that you have very small things like toad's legs being eaten there as well points to people using resources very intensively. So it may well be that people are staying at this place for longer. And indeed, if you look at the Sandstone Tall, this is not the sort of typical portable bit of kit that a mobile hunter-gatherer would be carrying around. So, Durham University, as I mentioned earlier, have been looking at all of the animal bones, all of the faunal assemblage, I should say the larger end of it. And they have made some really interesting identifications and analysis. One of them is, look at this stonking big percentage of aurochs from the site, sort of 57 to 59%, by a mile, biggest percentage in Europe. And of course, we shouldn't just look at these type of animals in a type of linear way. We have to think, well, what would they have meant? Obviously, they're of a great economic resource. Rick Scholting says that getting one down of average size would feed about 200 people. And this is really important and interesting because some of the population estimates for the Middle Mesolithic have been as low as 5,000 for the whole of Great Britain. Even you see 20,000 as a type of outlier. So if you've got one of these things that can feed 200s, and these are not wasteful people, it's very significant. Other types of animal there as well, and what's interesting about them is that, of course, most of them are coming in at different seasons to the aurochs. So again, perhaps an indication that people are staying at the site for longer because they've got these really good resources. Where it says 0%, eagle-eyed people here will have probably seen that. Where it says 0%, it means we found one piece of animal bone. And can you see that there's a wolf up there? Well, that's really interesting. We're in the process of getting a big monograph out for the first phase of the work on the site. And when Durham's report went through for peer review, the peer reviewer just queried whether, and in fact it was a wolf's tooth, whether that tooth was from a wolf. And rather excitingly, he said, well, perhaps it's actually from a dog. Can you imagine why it being from a dog would be of interest and exciting? So it's sort of something domesticated. It also means that where you have a dog, usually you would see a dog as proxy for people. So we were very keen to run an isotopic tests on the dog's tooth to find out where that dog might have come from and what it was eating. And you're the first audience to get this information because we only got the information about 10 days ago. So here we go. It's really interesting. So Blick Mead dog we didn't get a radiocarbon date from it, but from the context it came from, it comes out as a nice 5th millennium BC date. Good levels of preservation. Its carbon isotopes showed it to be eating, surprise, surprise, aurochs mainly, some red deer, some wild pig, and some fish. And the Natural History Museum, Simon Parfitt, whose brilliant work identified the toad's bone, Simon Parfitt has said, you know, there's quite a lot of fish being eaten, probably salmon and trout, certainly one pike. So that type of background really fits with what the people were eating at the site. So that's terrific and very interesting. The thing that's quite type of amazing is where the dog came from. And its oxygen isotope comes out just about, well, it's just over the line of in this geology here. So the type of geology that's in spring water and wells in the type of area, broadly speaking, around York into the Midlands and up in Scotland. I've double-checked with the specialist who's the main name on this report, and she says that she would be content to say this. The dog definitely doesn't come from the Blick Mead area, from well outside of it. It's likely to come from the area around York, but that's not certain. So it's somewhere to the north and the east. But it's an interesting result, isn't it? I mean, again, isotopic analysis can be a bit broad brush, but you're getting that sense of people coming in from elsewhere. But really interestingly, this is the earliest date for a movement of people into the Stonehenge landscape. And that's of profound interest, that we're getting that sense of journeys to them, and those being mapped. So why Blick Mead? Why would people be coming to Blick Mead? What makes it so special? Well, this photograph taken 3 years ago when it was -8 in January gives you a clue. The water temperature is a spring water is at a constant temperature of 10 to 14 centigrade all year round, so whatever the weather. You get extended growing seasons. So some of you might be able to see that there is some greenery just on the edge here of the snow. So you get extended growing seasons at the site. It's protected by a bluff to the southwest, which type of knocks out the prevailing wind from that direction. Very good contacts and communication networks into the River Avon and beyond. Plentiful supply of wood and really good supply of flint nodules. So there's a lot going for it. I think perhaps the way to look at it is to not put humans first, but to think about what the animals would like. And clearly this type of setup is going to be attracting large herbivores at this time of year. People are going to be, the animals are going to be coming in because they need accessible places to drink water. The River Avon has been calculated to be about 60 metres wide in the Middle Mesolithic, and it would have been a much wilder place, harder to type of access than now. There's been this other thing, some of you may have seen this on TV, that we have this type of weird phenomena at the site, where in a certain part of it, that if you put flints into the spring water and then remove them over a certain period of time, the flints turn bright pink. That's to do with Professor David John from the Natural History Museum is our expert for this, and he's explained this is to do with a algae called Hildenbrandia rivularis, with a very sort of fussy algae. It needs to be in a certain type of ecosystem, and when it's exposed to air, it can turn flints, various varieties of pink and crimson and magenta. This one is actually on display now at a museum in Vienna. Also of interest with this is that Professor John explains that this pink crust is actually a natural dye. And I invited some students who'd failed their GCSE English in Amesbury to the site. They're all lads, type of quite, not particularly type of keen on being there, to be honest. But when they saw the tools, they had a better idea, I think, than lots of the specialists. They said straight away, I was trying to say to them, well, lots of people are type of, if we were really honest about them, these very small tools, which are typical of the Mesolithic, they're so small, they don't seem to have got much of a practical use. What do you think? And these lads said, well, pretty obvious, they're being used for tattooing. So you don't get many type of, middle-aged archaeologists type of thinking like that. And of course, if you just hold that thought and then you think, well, this is a natural dye, but a type of quite scarce, probably special dye. Imagine people's responses when they pull these things out and over a period of time they're turning really pink. It may well be that you have people going around with pink tattoos. So, and that's the type of marker of the place. So, interesting, potentially perhaps a sort of sacred, magical, certainly a transformative phenomena. We're pretty sure that especially the aurochs are in and around the spring area, because we've also run an isotopic analysis on an aurochs tooth, which showed it was very much a local animal. But of course, these things are so big, type of twice the size of a British cow now, enormous things, and ferocious, and real eaters. We have to sort of start thinking about the relationship between Blick Mead and the area around Stonehenge where the posts were, and think about how this might have worked for these animals. And also thinking about these animals in symbolic terms, perhaps sacred terms. As I'm sure lots of people know, this is a little section from the Lascaux frieze, sort of Upper Paleolithic art. And I don't think these friezes are purely practical. There's probably some sort of veneration of these big animals as well. So have a look at this LiDAR image. So type of way of looking at Stonehenge which isn't usually sort of thought about, and certainly thinking about it from a hunter-gatherer point of view. Here's an old river here, Stonehenge bottom, and a fording point, and various side valleys coming off the place. So as I say, if we look at this for the first time really from a hunter-gatherer perspective, and also be noticing that these posts, although possibly or probably they weren't all there in the same place, but can you see that they seem to fit the type of slight dog leg of this side valley? They're not in a nice little neat diagonal. If we start looking at this landscape from a hunter-gatherer point of view, and from particularly a hunting point of view, some various sort of interesting perspectives emerge from it. I mean, one of them is, if you go to Stonehenge, brilliant, but please do get out there into the landscape, because when you experience even the very nearby landscape, you'll see that the place is all full of type of mini hillocks and side valleys, actually brilliant places to hide if you're hunting animals and observe their movements. And if you type of apply that thinking back to this LiDAR image, potentially what we're picking up here is the area around where the posts are is intercept points for killing large animals. We've got these various type of side valley funnels, type of directing large herbivore movement down into this funnel. Here's the only fording points. So the direction of these posts might be something practical. They might be type of marking out where the movement of the animal is coming from, or perhaps if you're looking at the area from the ridges around Stonehenge, you can just perhaps get some time sense of when the animals are coming through. Perhaps there's something more sacred than that, not sure, but it is certainly these type of ridges are wonderful viewing platforms for seeing large animals. So it's a new thought, but it might explain how this landscape is utilised. Something of interest is that the Cursus, which is middle Neolithic, around about 3,500 BC, that has pine charcoal, which is obviously a signature because pine goes out of this landscape or was thought to anyway, certainly by the middle Neolithic. Pine charcoal is found in its western terminus. So this looks to me as though the Cursus is incorporating a type of known place in the Mesolithic. So it's deliberately matching to it. Rather interestingly, Amesbury 42, the long barrow at its eastern end, has an Oryx skull in it, or had an Oryx skull in it. So there, if you look at the orientation of the Cursus, can you see the way it roughly follows the line of the side valley? And I think rather interestingly as well, it's not only following that line, but it's also following the natural topography as well. It's going into the wet here and then upslope. So a question is whether people in the early to mid-Neolithic, when they were building the Cursus, whether some stories had come down of this place being a sacred hunting place. All right, so where did they live? And this is the thing that we were missing up until very recently. Here's the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes team, ground-penetrating radar, the terrace site that I pointed out earlier. They produce this stacked image. It goes every 50 centimetres it goes down, and you'll see that at the 2 metre points, they were picking up on a feature, what looked like a discrete feature here, lots of type of high resistance from things that look like stones. And we thought that would be a really good target. And actually up till this point, the Hidden Landscapes Project hadn't had anybody digging on into one of their targets. So it was interesting from their point of view as well. So we did that in 2014, 5 metre by 5 metre trench. We got a radiocarbon date from here, which I'll point out in a minute. Various features straight away. And though we can't say that the ground-penetrating radar exactly hit the features that were implied by that radar image, they certainly, if it hadn't been for them, we wouldn't have dug here. And certainly some of the features fit beautifully with that image. And I'll just go through these now. So this is of interest. You'll see it type of exposed in a couple of slides' time. Classic archaeology, you just find the really interesting thing right up against the side and then have to wait another year to dig it out. But this looks like some sort of revetted edge, rather similar, looking very similar really to the type of classification of pit dwellings that people like Graham Clark were type of giving to sites, Mesolithic sites in the 1930s. So in other words, a place where perhaps people might have been living. Enormous quantities of very intensively fired burnt flint from another pit close to the Rivetting Pit, and actually 14 kilograms worth. I mean, it's really just a sort of an enormous amount of heat would have come off this. This raised stone as well, very enigmatic, and you can see the type of time depth, but in the earth depth there as well. It's definitely been set. There's not been a hole put in for it, and it's been put into the hole, but it's clearly perhaps been something that's been straightened and made upright. We're wondering if it was used as a wedge actually for a structure. And at the end of 2014, we got this radiocarbon date from the area, 4336 to 4246 BC. Very important date for Stonehenge. This is a real missing link, very late 5th millennium BC. You might remember I said earlier that the common thought about the Mesolithic is that people had either or the culture had gone by 4,500 BC. So we've got Mesolithic culture persisting later here than anybody expected. So last year's dig was really important because we wanted to see what that riveted image was, what might have been in it, and just try and make sense of it opening up a broader area. We were keen to, I should say that we knew that we were dealing with a latent Mesolithic because we have these exquisite, almost like works of art, microliths. Look how small these things are. And it's not just the fact that the objects are small in themselves, but can you see that they've all been worked all along the edges and sides? So, I mean, for somebody to have the dexterity to manage this is really extraordinary. We're trying to think about, well, first of all, what would be the practical use of them? And secondly, who could have done it? And we're wondering, actually, perhaps not children of this age, but certainly we're thinking that children might have been used to make really small tools like that, partly because when you have pre-literate societies, they often physicalise narratives, don't they? And often these things can be acts of memory, that when you're producing something, you're thinking about the past. And if that sounds abstract, you know, very sadly for my family, my mum is terminally ill, and she makes these really eccentric, I'll have to be careful what I'm saying here because I know I'm being filmed and recorded, but she makes these very eccentric Christmas cakes. And it just strikes me that when, you know, things naturally occur down the line, it might well be, I come from a big family, it might well be that a number of us make a Christmas cake like Mum made. And in some senses, we wouldn't just be making a Christmas cake, would we? What we'd sort of in some sense be doing is bringing Mum back. As I say, if that makes a better sense of physicalising narratives, then it's worth saying. So perhaps these tools are working as a type of enculturing, type of educative, giving people information about their past. They would have taken an awful lot of concentration to make. Okay, so 2015, here is that riveted pit that you saw earlier. And I'm just going to show you a sequence as we're going down. First of all, a couple of things to notice. An interesting scoop up at the top here, which had seemingly been put on top of whatever this is, probably at a later date. And there's something that we weren't expecting was this body of chalk starting to come through. And then as things were exposed, it became more and more clear what this thing is and what the area is around it. It looks like, in fact, I think certainly, that a very large, and we now know, oak tree collapsed and fell over into the spring. It was probably hundreds of years old. And it brought up this chalk ball, that's what that is. And people modified the area by packing flint nodules around it. I think rather sweetly, possibly as a type of final, and this is speculative, but possibly as a sort of final closing moment, they put this beautifully worked sarsen stone, again, something that has come from outside of the area. We think it's a sarsen river cobble, beautifully worked, perhaps used as for tenderizing meat. They place that on the top of the mound. And this gives you type of a better sense of the whole area that we've been digging. So you have this large modified tree throw. We caught, very fortunately, the edge of the spring. The burnt flint I mentioned, the upper fill of what we discovered last year was actually a much earlier tree throw. Possible post hole here. That gave us the date in 2014, the late 5th millennium BC date. Another post hole, and that little standing stone, that's raised stone. So because of the material inside here, these little microliths, we also found 4 Oryx teeth, and also because of just trying to make sense of these features in relationship to each other, we posited that this might be a shelter. You would have a big high root wall here, perhaps a post with an animal skin going over it, and actually the burnt flint, very type of clever of people potentially, because rather than having a fire inside a shelter with an animal skin around it, people are bringing in burnt flint, so you've got a much lower fire risk. Sort of thing that health and safety would approve of now, in fact. It would have worked perhaps like a convector heater. So these are all thoughts. Of course, the big question was, that radiocarbon date, that's late 5th millennium BC date, was that some rogue date? It's not enough to say this is a house or a residential and activity area unless you have one or two of those dates so that they chime together. For people who are finding it hard to visualise this place being a place where people live, this might help. As it happened on site, a few years ago, another large tree had fallen over, not as big as the oak, I should say, though. And you can see the potential for a wall that comes from a tree falling over of that type of size. Okay, here are the radiocarbon dates coming through then. I should have just given you a bit of a build-up. Here are the radiocarbon dates coming through. These new ones. First one is going to be from the lower fill, so from the base of the smaller tree throw. Lot hanging on this, ladies and gentlemen. And we got a terrific early Mesolithic date, which certainly pleased one of my PhD students who's interested in that period. 95% probability that you've got this very early Mesolithic date, 8th millennium BC date. So terrific, especially as it had a type of proto-tranchette axe in that context. So it's sort of dating the axe. I understand from Keith that has been recently subjected to use where, I mean, we were hoping that might have been one of the things used for building the monuments, but it isn't. Terrific, though. Shows activity in the Mesolithic going on very early at the site, but it didn't fit well, obviously, with the 5th millennium BC date. So the samples that actually came from the shelter were crucial here. First of all, we got one from the putty chalk between what we thought was a shelter and the post hole, and that was reassuringly, marvellously, frankly, right back to the 5th millennium BC. What you're looking at here are this is really taking us into the unknown with Stonehenge and its story. So understanding the significance of it. These very late 5th millennium BC dates, not meant to be Mesolithic culture, persisting anywhere in England, and it is happening here, right on the springboard to the Neolithic. Inside what we thought was the shelter area, underneath that revetted cobbled surface, we got a date that was a little earlier. And my goodness, this is really something. So we're right at what most people would consider to be the transitional point into the early Neolithic. In fact, most people would have assumed that all of the late 5th millennium BC dates were early Neolithic. But yet, Mesolithic culture, as you've seen from those small microliths, persisting, and finally, in the lower fill of the tree through, a very similar date indeed. So we have a very tightly dated sequence here, which very firmly situates people living here, this is a residential and activity area, in the very late 5th millennium BC. Well, that's all very well and good, but we need to be thinking about that in terms of putting a human focus on it, because for the first time in this landscape and anywhere else in Britain, we have got a type of potential snapshot of Mesolithic culture transitioning into Neolithic culture. It's highly likely that people here would have met Neolithic incomers, and that's never been found before. And we shouldn't think of the Neolithic as sometimes it's type of set out in older archaeology books as though there's some big D-Day invasion worth of the Neolithic people coming over. Almost certainly at the beginning you've got pioneer Neolithic groups and they're meeting people here and probably families are coming out of that and children. And so it does start to make you really reconsider the establishment of the early ritual landscape at Stonehenge. This contact point, perhaps was a bridge that all sorts of prior associations about the landscape went across from. And then suddenly finds that have happened much earlier, this is about 20 years old, this discovery, that there's a so-called cow bone underneath Sarsen 27. They're suddenly given, it's like the bit in The Wizard of Oz when it turns colour, because all of a sudden you see this radiocarbon, that wonderful match with those late Mesolithic ones from Blick Mead. It shows that people in the late Mesolithic are still going back to the Stonehenge knoll and doing something involving animals there, as they were in the 8th and the 7th millennium BC. I just thought it might be worth putting in Tim Darville's quote from 2006. This is indicative of pre-henge activity that is otherwise invisible. So this is where Blick Mead is really filling the spaces. Just checking for time. Also, type of cast colour onto these very early Neolithic dates. The Conabry anomaly, which one of my students, Yvonne, was working on last year, has a radiocarbon date of around 3,800, 3,700. All of a sudden, with these new Blick Mead dates, that's in range, isn't it? And in fact, the fills from the Conabry anomaly are very odd. It's a mixture of wild animals and even a fish. Really, I mean, the fish bit, completely unique for a Neolithic pit in Britain. And you don't normally get many wild animals at all in Neolithic pits. But mixed with domestic animals, with Neolithic leaf-shaped arrowheads and even pottery and some grain. Rather than this being a type of one-off feasting party, which is being described recently in a book on Stonehenge, I wonder if there's something much more subtle and interesting and dynamic going on. Have we got here on this ridge, which is intervisible between the later site of Stonehenge and Vespasian's camp, have we got some type of moment of cultural appropriation or assimilation going on, or at least a display of it? And that the feasting actually was not to do with a party as such, but actually to do with people coming together. And Conabry anomaly is also intervisible with West Amesbury, so-called Bluestonehenge, later radiocarbon date, very near Vespasian's camp, and hey presto, this excavation by the Riverside Project, brilliant excavation which was focused on the Neolithic really, they discovered a cache of about 500 Mesolithic work flints dating from across the Mesolithic period. So it's another example of a Neolithic monument having a type of Mesolithic place integrated into it. That would be my argument. And the very final radiocarbon date that came out of Blick Mead this summer is in fact a type of early middle-ish Neolithic date, not far off from Bluestonehenge, and it comes from that scoop I mentioned, which seemingly was just above the tree throw. So it's almost as though people are seeing that type of landscape feature, maybe some type of remnants of it, and digging into it. You know, if you were being type of very imaginative, you could almost wonder are they picking up on older memories there. Moving on swiftly, I've mentioned the cursus. That last radiocarbon date chimes with that. Also chimes with the first long barrows going up in the landscape. Here's the oldest skeleton from one of the long barrows. It's Gentis from Winterbourne, Stoke. He's interesting because his isotope values point to him regularly going back to the west, possibly Wales. And some people have speculated, well, perhaps is this type of movement responsible for the Bluestones being taken to Stonehenge? I don't know, but I do think, just to get this out there, I do think it's worth really reconsidering this idea of Stonehenge as a temple, which seems to me to be a very classical way of looking at a type of much earlier monument. What might be better is looking at it from a hunter-gatherer point of view, or at least a hunting culture point of view, and applying an animistic way of seeing it. And look that way, perhaps the motivation for moving these stones such a long way, and even the bigger ones, type of comes into a sharper focus. Could it be something like this, that as people are moving stones, they're bringing out the spirit in them? And perhaps people thought that when they were building Stonehenge, they were basically making a god, in which case Stonehenge would be altogether more special than we realise it is now. Not just a type of house for a god, but a god in itself. So these type of readings have been entirely missing before Blick Mead, but worth thinking about. I should say as well that both the Stonehenge Riverside Project and the Spaces team that Tim Darvell and Jeff Wainwright run, the places that they suggest for quarries for the Bluestones, again, have these type of Mesolithic antecedents. So that's rather interesting too. We don't want to make too much out of it, but it's worth getting out there. Postscript, so just the last couple of slides. Last couple of days of the dig last year, our wonderful team, we still have a substantial number of volunteers and locals from the Amesbury area who were there right at the beginning when we only had £2,000 a year. People are very, very aware of their flint, and they found arrowhead like this. And it's a ripple flaked oblique arrowhead. Very rare. You only find them at henge sites. So in the Wessex area, Durrington Walls, Mardenhenge, and a Bluestones, West Amesbury henge at the entrance to the avenue. The fact that we found them at Blick Mead has made Barry Bishop, our lithics expert, so very, very well, nationally well-respected lithics expert, he has said, around about 2600 BC, sort of Stonehenge in its heyday, Blick Mead must have been part of the broader Stonehenge ceremonial landscape, the ritual landscape. So this is a very new thing, so perhaps there was some type of henge there too. But why? Is it purely practical that you've got a spring there, or is it because of people having these very long-term memories? Mike Parker Pearson has been kind enough to say in his book that came out last year, Blick Mead may be more than just a handy place to gather, but somewhere that people return to as a place of origin. And that's why, if Mike is saying that, it's very much what I think it is reasonable to say it's the cradle of Stonehenge. A place of origins are cradles, aren't they? And he continues to say, over the centuries and millennia, it was used, this place would have become the centre of a network of paths leading towards it from many parts of southern Britain. Well, we know, this audience knows now, not just southern Britain. Just as all roads led to Rome, so these paths led to the future site of Stonehenge. That's archaeology for you. I started with Donald Rumsfeld. I wanted to finish with Tennyson, because I think he gets the mystery of archaeology. You can only get so far with archaeology. There rolls the deep, where grew the tree, O earth, what changes hast thou seen? There where the long street roars hath been the stillness of the central sea. The hills are shadows and they flow from form to form and nothing stands. They melt like mist, the solid lands, like clouds they shape themselves and go. But in my spirit will I dwell and dream my dream and hold it true. For though my lips may breathe adieu, I cannot think the thing farewell. Tennyson's also great as a type of antidote to the tunnel. Thank you very much.